I'm so excited always to do that. You know, I'm not going to give a long introduction or anything. I've decided that everybody here wants to hear you. So with that, I would like to start the program immediately with your topic. And yes, aren't we all excited today for the first woman of color vice president nominee? And from there, I'm going to turn the program over to you. Robert?
Thank you, Dr. Miriam. Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Rachel. Let me acknowledge again the University of Miami Holocaust Institute, the NCJW, and the Miami Beach JCC. I have had the great pleasure and good fortune of doing a number of programs with all three of you in those organizations in the past. So it's always a delight and an honor. I'm looking at our Brady Bunch pictures here on the on the screen, and I'm seeing Richard and Karen and Iris and Bill and lots of friends of mine. So good to see all my friends. A real pleasure, and I'm seeing some new friends. Oh, I see Maris Newmark too. I see lots of people I know. And to the teachers, welcome. I'm really excited about this topic for a number of reasons. One, of course, African-American and South Asian woman as vice presidential selection. She is not the first woman of color to be picked as a vice president, but only on a major party ticket. We've had third parties that have had women of color, from American Indian women to African-American women and so on. We've had women on the ticket at the #1 and #2 spots since the 1800s. And we'll talk about that a little bit later in this program, but it's very historic. Also, a week from yesterday is the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, women getting the right to vote. So it's an exciting time. And as an historian, I just love all these wonderful historic moments, and they're teachable moments as well. I just came from class, and I talked about this in my class as well. So I'm going to share my screen. I put a PowerPoint together for you, which I don't like to do, but people like it, so I'll do a PowerPoint. Also, Karen, my niece Willow, is on the call, like your granddaughter. Anyway, so hello, Willow, who is a ballerina, a New York City famous ballerina. Anyway, so here we go. And don't ask me to dance, by the way. So I'm going to share there's some things that we just don't want to see. So I'm going to share the screen here. All right. So the 19th Amendment, it may sound like, oh, you know, what a boring topic, but it's a wonderful topic. The story is intriguing. And it was a long fought struggle with lots of twists and turns. There's a wonderfully poetic and just ironic end to this, which I'll get to. So I want to talk about the story of the 19th Amendment. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about women in politics for the last 100 years. And I did a really fun study several years ago where I surveyed and interviewed actually a couple hundred women that are serving in elected office around the country, asking them questions about what women bring to elected office and some of the challenges. So I thought I'd share some of the highlights with you. I've also interviewed several women that have run for president or vice president, and I'll share with you some of the things they told me. So that's what we'll do today. So here we go. Let's talk about the 19th Amendment. So our story begins in the year 1840. So 1840, with these two ladies. There on the left is Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and I'm a big fan of hers. She was from New York, remarkably well-read woman in a day and age where that was hard to say, read the classics. She was a political activist. Elizabeth Cady Stanton cut her teeth in the abolitionist movement, fighting against slavery. So she was a grassroots organizer, a real advocate for social justice. On the right is Lucretia Mott, who would become her partner in launching this effort to get women the right to vote. Mott was from Massachusetts. She was a Quaker. And of course, the Quakers in Massachusetts and Pennsylvania have a very interesting history as folks who prioritized an education and prioritized social justice. Causes like abolition, pacifism, and the rights of the American Indians. So they were very ahead of themselves. We sometimes have this view, I don't know if it's because of Quaker Oats cereal and the guy on the box, but we sometimes have this pilgrim puritanical view when the Quakers could be quite progressive on social justice issues. And like Stanton, Mott was well read and was a grassroots organizer also. So these two meet in the year 1840, and the circumstances are fun. So Elizabeth Cady Stanton just got married, and her husband says, "What do you want to do for your honeymoon?" Rather than saying Monte Carlo or Sedona, Arizona, or some fun place, she says, "Hey, there's an international anti-slavery conference in Europe. I want to go to it for the honeymoon." My kind of gal. So they go all the way to Europe, which of course is an enormous travel in a wooden sailboat in the 1800s. They get there, and guess what? Women are not allowed in. So after all that, she arrives there and she's not allowed to attend. So Stanton is out in the outside of the event fuming, and another woman travels all the way there and isn't allowed to go in, and that's Lucretia Mott. So they meet each other outside and they're talking and they're saying, we need to do something. Here we are traveling halfway around the world to fight to end slavery, and women are not allowed to join the fight. We need to push for women to get the right to vote. And while they're outside stewing, there's a break in the conference, and a man, an African-American man, comes out and he sees the two of them and approaches them and introduces himself. He is outraged that women are not allowed in, and he wants to join with them in the effort. His name was Frederick Douglass, the great former slave orator. And Douglass and Stanton, by the way, would become best buds, and they would work together for their entire lives on a number of issues. So when they get back stateside, the three of them start working on a conference for women's rights. And that would culminate in the year 1848 with the Seneca Falls Convention. And if you're in Seneca Falls, I recommend you stop and see some of the historic sites. It's well worth your visit. So they gather in Seneca Falls, New York in July of 1848, and over 300 folks attend, men and women, white and black, and it's a 2-day conference. Now, men were allowed in, but only on the second day. So it's a 2-day conference, and they're pushing 11 resolutions that Stanton, Mott, and other early mothers of the movement had put together. Now, the first 10 of the 11 resolutions are interesting, and you would think they'd be no-brainers, but things like this. In some states and in some countries in the 1800s and 1840s, women could not legally inherit property. Women could not legally divorce. Men could divorce. Men had no fault divorce. They could just say, I divorce you. Women could not legally divorce. What's interesting from today's perspective is if there's a divorce today and there are young children involved, almost by default, the mother gets custody of the young children, almost by default. In the year 1848, almost by default, the man got custody of the children. In fact, there were situations whereby if a husband and wife, if the man died, the children would be given, in terms of legal custody, to his brother or the wife's brother. So this is how sexist it was. So inheriting property, owning land, you couldn't appear in a court of law, couldn't legally get a license to open up a business, a husband or a brother had to sign for you, all these things. So this was these were resolutions 1 through 10. And all those passed unanimously. Now, day 2, we get to issue 11, resolution 11, the right to vote. This was very controversial. The concern among some of the mothers of the movement was we will alienate too many men if we push for women getting the right to vote. We will also alienate folks in the South, rural areas, preachers, and other folks that seem to be against such things. So there was a lot of debate on the floor, so Stanton and Mott called for a recess. Stanton goes outside with Frederick Douglass to talk about this, and they both decide, no, we need to promote a woman's right to vote. So they went inside, and Stanton gave a speech, then Frederick Douglass gave a speech. Tragically, Frederick Douglass lived in the pre-video and pre-audio era, but he would have been an early prototype for Martin Luther King. Dramatic, theatrical, a baritone voice, the face, the stage presence, just a remarkable speaker. And Douglas brought the roof down. And after one of his legendary speeches, they called for a vote, and Resolution 11, women getting the right to vote, passed. Douglas used to give this one version of a speech, just if I may digress for a couple of quick seconds, where when he would talk about slavery, what he did though is he tried to put the audience into the mindset, into the shoes of the slave, so to speak. So what he would do is, we didn't have electricity at the time, so he didn't have lights. So he would be on stage holding a lantern, and all the torches and it, on the walls, it would create a flickering sense. And he had this chiseled face. And he would evoke images, much like Martin Luther King in his I Have a Dream speech, from Stone Mountain to the Rockies he would say, yea, even on Mark Twain's beloved Mississippi, I hear the crack of the whip and the shackle of the chain. He would evoke all these very vivid sensory experiences, but he would then end it by saying, but yet our movement has grown too strong to be snuffed out like a lantern. And he would put the light out. When they got the lights back on, he was off the stage. So the theatrical, the dramatic, so one can only imagine his speech. So it passed. So now the movement is, how do we then get from having a group of 300 plus people? How do we educate the public? Where do we go next? Unfortunately, the movement was put on hold because of the Civil War. Of course, everything's put on hold. However, Stanton Mott and others realized that this is an opportunity for them to prove a woman's worth in many ways. Therefore, they encouraged women to back the war effort and get involved in it. We have women who dressed in disguise and fought in the war. There were women who were killed in the war. Women served as spies. Women served as guides. If the Union Army needed to get somewhere into the South, Harriet Tubman was a guide for the Union Army because people didn't suspect women. They served in a number of capacities, mostly though as nurses. Now, I don't mean to be too graphic, but think of the following. I just finished a book on the Civil War. Imagine, you're talking hundreds of thousands of deaths and hundreds more thousands of casualties. It was not uncommon for a battle to incur 10, 15, 20, 30,000 men dead and more wounded. They set up these field hospitals. Imagine an even more primitive MASH field hospital, where the descriptions were that beside the operating table would be a 5-foot-high pile of arms and feet and legs and fingers. And these mothers of the movement were the nurses in these field hospitals. Mind you, they didn't go to nursing school. They were learning on the fly. You literally had a man get down on the, on the operating table. And if you had a catastrophic wound to the arm or leg, if untreated, that would cost the body. So to save the body, you have to remove the arm or leg. They would have them bite down on a raw strap, take a shot of whiskey, and the nurses would be holding them down and they'd get the saw out. Then you'd have to try to comfort this person who's in post-traumatic, get a bucket of water, throw it on the operating table, and lift the next guy up. This is what they were doing. So they earned their stripes. They proved their mettle. They proved their worth. What's also interesting is the women of the movement were arguably among the biggest supporters that Abraham Lincoln had. Abraham Lincoln was enormously unpopular during most of his presidency. In fact, his reelection in 1864 probably shouldn't have happened. Thank God it did. So the mothers of the movement were the ones backing Lincoln. In fact, I have a theory. If Lincoln had won, if Lincoln had lived and not been assassinated in 1865, when Black men got the right to vote in 1870, I think women would have been included. Lincoln would have pushed it. At any rate, so they were supporters, and I have here on your screen the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. These are Lincoln's Reconstruction Amendments. So as the war ends in 1865, Lincoln, along with Frederick Douglass, designed Reconstruction. He was the architect. This is this remarkable, talk about empathy and humanity and magnanimity in the White House. Lincoln forgave the South. He paroled Robert E. Lee. He did not want to see Confederates dragged through the streets in chains. He wanted forgiveness. He wanted healing. In his second inaugural, Lincoln even says both sides drew the sword. We both prayed to the same God. We're both guilty. Well, they weren't. It was the South that was guilty. But what magnanimity. Lincoln even told Grant and Joshua Chamberlain, one of my favorite Union officers, he was a professor. Professors can be tough too. Professor of Humanities at Bowdoin in Maine. At any rate, Lincoln told Chamberlain and Grant, when Robert E. Lee and the Confederates surrender, I don't want you gloating. I don't want you rejoicing. Let's remember all that we've lost. And he had the Union band play Dixie. Take your pistol and your horse and go home. That was the orders. Remarkable. So here's Lincoln's reconstruction, the 13th, 14th, and 15th. Tragically, he would only live to see the 13th, but he designed the other two. The 13th Amendment ends slavery in 1865. And this was controversial, very unpopular in the South. Who were the big supporters of it? Women. The 14th Amendment in 1868 is the Equal Protection Clause. Slaves can become citizens, equal protection under the law. And who were the big supporters of this? Women. By the way, the current president has called for revoking the 14th Amendment. The 15th Amendment, 1870, was known as Negro male suffrage. Today, we would say Black men get the right to vote. And who were the big supporters of it? You guessed it, women. Now, not Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Stanton said, no, wait a minute. It should be Black men and all women get the right to vote. So it was a big issue, and Stanton even contemplated maybe not supporting this. And there was a rift, a split in the movement, the women's movement. Should we support it? After all, most of us are abolitionists, and we're about social justice and rights. But on the other hand, if we don't get this now, when are we going to get it? Ultimately, Stanton said, okay, I'll support it. You know, she had a point. Women would not get the right to vote until 1920, a full half century after the 15th Amendment in 1870, giving Black men the right to vote. Women also were involved in other things during and after the war. One was orphanages. Think of the situation, deplorable, unacceptable situation of foster care in most orphanages today. It's a tragedy that we don't do more about this. Can you imagine in the 1860s, everyone? And how many orphans we had because of the war? Who set up orphanages and took care of folks and arranged foster care? It was the early mothers of the women's movement that did it. Also temperance. This is against alcohol. Now, those of you that know me know that there's a couple things I love to do in my career and a 30-year career as a professor, and that is, one is to try to find the history people don't know about. I love hidden history. It's my sweet spot. But the other thing is I like to look at mistakes that historians make and things that we get wrong about history. One of them is temperance. We tend to depict temperance as fuddy-duddy women dressed up like they're going to church with the big hat who are against alcohol. No, it was the early mothers of the movement that advocated temperance, and here's why. Rape and domestic violence. You know, we did not even have a term called domestic violence or spousal abuse or sexual assault until the 1960s and 1970s. Can you even imagine, everyone? The statistics on violence against women in all forms today are jaw-dropping and unacceptable. Could you imagine in the 1860s, everyone? Just unthinkable. Now, I've written several books that are set in the 1700s and 1800s, two periods in history I really like. I have a rule, there's no way of really getting a firm number, but I have a rule, and here's my rule based on reading hundreds of diaries and newspapers and war reports from those 2 centuries. I think 1 out of every 3 men was a full-blown alcoholic, I mean face down, drunk in the 17 and 1800s. Alcoholism was a pandemic. My guess, 1 in 3. Now, can you imagine all the violence against children and women that came from alcohol? So the mothers of the movement were advocates for temperance because of women's safety and health. So they were involved in everything. All right, fast forward. New leadership emerges after the Civil War and through the 1870s with Susan B. Anthony, and that's a picture of her there, and Lucy Stone. Now, I'm not a big fan of Susan B. Anthony's. I'll talk about another one of my heroes, because I like Stanton coming up in a moment, but I'm more of a fan of Lucy Stone. At any rate, there was a big split, although Lucy Stone was also a mixed bag. There was Susan B. Anthony was the head of the National Women's Suffrage Association, and Lucy Stone, the American Women's Suffrage Association. So tragically, the movement split in half. The Susan B. Anthony wing was more conservative. The Lucy Stone wing was more liberal. Susan B. Anthony's was more status quo and older. Lucy Stone's was younger. But one of the big issues over the split was family planning. Susan B. Anthony was against family planning, abortion rights, access to birth control, whereas Stone favored it. Now, you've all heard of the Comstock laws in New York and elsewhere. There were these prototypes, these laws that said, if you mailed obscenity, violence, pornography in the mail, you could be arrested under these laws. Here's the kicker though. They considered family planning, education about women's health to be obscene and pornographic. So if Karen is a nurse and Karen is sending Miriam some information just on family planning and on 9 months of pregnancy and so forth and so on, that could be considered obscene and she could be arrested. So this is where the status was. So tragically, Susan B. Anthony, I think, was on the wrong side of history there. But Stone and others were on the right side of history. But there was a big split, which really delayed the women's movement for about a decade, until, here's someone I really like. That's Carrie Chapman Catt. I'm a big fan of Triple C, Carrie Chapman Catt. So she comes along, and in 1890, she does several things. One, she heals the rift. She's the one that brings the national and the American groups together, saying, why are we fighting with one another, for crying out loud? Our argument, our fight is out there, not internally. So she brings them together under the National American Women's Suffrage Association, finds common ground. So she's very political like that. The other thing she does is she says, you know, the fight for a right to vote and all these other, to divorce, own property, get a business license, go to law school, the fight, we maybe need to focus on young women and young men. Maybe it's too late for some of us older folks. So what she does is she gets young women and she trains them on how to speak to the media, give public speeches about women's issues. And armed with this information and training, they go out there and start speaking and start talking to the press. And they're very articulate, very informed, and very impressive. Here's the purpose. It's a significance. Men didn't think that women were capable of such things, but all of a sudden they're hearing from all these articulate, informed young women, and it's changing the paradigm. Men are starting to say, wow, you know, women are capable. Women are people too. So she does that. Then there's 100 other things, but here's the one I want to talk about. She comes up with a new strategy for the movement. If you want to amend the Constitution, which is what the 19th Amendment does, if you want to change the Constitution, you need 2/3 of Congress, both chambers, bicameral, and 3/4 of the states. What she says is it's a difficult thing to get 3/4 of the states, but why don't we do this? Why don't we just get one state to pass it? Once we get one state, it's easier, then we can get a second. Plus, aren't we going to need those states eventually anyway, when we need 3/4 of the states? So she shifts the strategy from a nationwide campaign for women getting the right to vote to state by state by state. Now, that makes perfect sense. Brilliant. We're all in agreement. So the women's movement says, okay, we're going to start where? New York, Massachusetts. That's the obvious place to start. She says, no, we're going to start in states and territories way out west. We're going to go to Wyoming and Montana and Utah and Idaho. Can you imagine these places in the 1800s? It's straight out of a Clint Eastwood or John Wayne cowboy movie, right? And you're thinking, wait, this is the most conservative, violent, anti-woman. Why would you start there? And this is what she says, because there's no women there. And the men, therefore, are very desperate. So what she does is she goes to Wyoming and Idaho and Utah. Wyoming was a territory. And this is what she says. If you give women the right to vote, I will see that a lot of women move to your state or territory. There's one woman for every couple thousand men. The men were like, yeah, okay, good. Now, where do we sign? So she says, okay, let's do this. So she gets Wyoming, a territory, then follows it up with Colorado, Utah, and Idaho, which was just the end of the world back then. They all agree to give women the right to vote. And then they say, okay, now bring us out the women. What they used to do was once a season, always in the fall and spring, because the weather was rough in summer and winter, they would have a wagon of professional ladies across the country. And, you know, that was the women's population. But here's what she does. She says, okay, before I bring the women out, though, I needed something else from you. We need the right to inherit property, to own land, to divorce, to practice the law, to get a business license. She laid out all 10 of those early resolutions from Stanton and Mott. And then they said yes, and she made good on her end of the deal. Here's what she did. She went to women back east and said, you're trying to open up a business, but men won't give you the business license. If you go out there, they already have the business license waiting for you. You want to be a lawyer or practice medicine, or they'll do it out there. You want to inherit property. You lost your husband. You want to make sure you control your kids. Move out west. So a lot of younger and progressive women moved out west because of all the advantages. And guess what? It's working. Look at my list here. Women start, states start ratifying, and state by state, women are starting to gain these rights. So let's fast forward. The next big exciting moment is in 1912, Woodrow Wilson is running for president, okay? And he wins, and his inauguration's in 1913. Here's why women were excited. The women's movement knew that Wilson would be the guy to do this. Why? Wilson had been a professor at Bryn Mawr and Princeton. He was president of Princeton University. Wilson was a progressive. He said, I want to finish the great Teddy Roosevelt's progressive agenda. Teddy Roosevelt was president from 1901 to 1909. He was a Republican, but by today's standards, he would have been a Democrat. The parties switched positions from 1901 to 1909. So if you were a Republican in the 1800s, like Lincoln, you'd be a Democrat today. If you were a Democrat in the 1800s, think of Jackson or Jefferson, you'd be a Republican today. So think of Teddy Roosevelt's progressive legacy. Child labor laws, a prototype of a minimum wage, workplace safety, conservation. This is the great green Teddy Roosevelt, set aside more net acres of conservation lands than any president except Obama. So remarkable legacy, national parks, and so on. Teddy Roosevelt was disturbed by Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle, and pushed food inspections and meat inspection. Remarkable legacy. Teddy Roosevelt, get this, wanted women to have the right to vote and wanted universal health care. Wow. He didn't get those two through. He got everything else through. So Wilson says, as a progressive, I'm going to finish TR's legacy. That means what? Women get the right to vote. So the women's movement was excited. On the inauguration, today, inaugural day is January 20th. And boy, it can't come soon enough. But back then, inauguration day was on March 4th. 1937, under FDR, they moved it up. At any rate, so on March 3rd, the day before the inauguration, massive parades in the streets of Washington. The women's movement, the women's suffragettes. You can see pictures here. Some of them rode horses. Some of them were dressed like Amazons with big feathers and swords. I mean, way over the top, right? They had a massive parade because Wilson's inaugurated the next day. They knew it's going to happen. Guess what happened? Wilson flip-flopped. No women's right to vote. He doesn't support it. Unbelievable after all that. However, something happens. Wilson's wife dies. Ellen Axon Wilson dies in office. And Wilson is feeling terrible. He misses his wife horribly. He was also having an affair, and he was racked with guilt. He was having an affair with a woman named Mrs. Peck. In Congress, they used to call Wilson Mrs. Peck's bad boy. Wilson has 3 daughters. He's feeling, I need to do something for women. So he starts thinking, maybe I'll get back on this and support a woman's right to vote. Then something else happens. Wilson meets a widow. Her name was Edith Bowling Galt, G-A-L-T. And she's a saucy, opinionated, really like her. She was highly scandalous back in the 1900s. The newspapers used to write about how scandalous she was. Would you like to hear how scandalous she was? even though this is the very august NCJW in the Miami Beach JCC, although it's Miami Beach, so I guess I can tell you how scandalous she was. All right, everybody sit down. This is what the big scandal was. You ready? She used to drive her own car. I know, right? So that was, today she'd be a Kardashian. That was the equivalent. She drove her own car. The other thing she did was she went to parties unescorted. She drove herself to the party. Back then, if a woman was not escorted, she couldn't go to a party. In fact, women were not allowed to go to the White House unless if they had a male escort, a husband or someone. So that was Edith. She was saucy and opinionated. Woodrow Wilson meets her. And by the way, Wilson is very buttoned up and laced up socially. She rocks his world. And they start courting right away. It becomes a big controversy because Wilson is sharing World War I intelligence with Edith, his girlfriend. Talk about lack of a national security, credentials. The press follows them around on their dates. She's seen leaving the White House early in the mornings. Yeah. So the newspaper stories say when World War I started, Edith was so shocked she fell out of the president's bed. That was what the newspapers used to say. So Edith rocks Wilson's world. And part of the deal was she said, you got to get back on a woman's right to vote. So Edith is pushing, there she is. Edith is pushing Wilson to promote this. Wilson gets back on his original position. He supports a woman's right to vote. So in 1918, with his support, and equally important with Edith's support, it goes through the Congress. Get this, it passes the House, but it's 2 votes shy in the Senate. It doesn't pass. Now, usually when something like this happens, it's years before they bring it up. But the women's movement says we need to hurry and bring this back up. We were only 2 votes shy, and we need to do it while Wilson's still in office. More importantly, while Edith is still the first lady. So they bring it back up in 1920. And here's my story. A man, a mother, and a good boy. You got it? Remember that. A man, a mother, and a good boy. This is how the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote, passed in 1920. So first off, a man. They're looking at him right there. His name was James Mann, 2 N's. He's the person that introduced the 19th Amendment to Congress in the States. Now, here's why it's significant. This goes back to the brilliance of the mothers of the movement and the women in the movement. James Mann is a Republican. The movement knew that Republicans were against this, Democrats were for it. So what a symbolic, brilliant move to have a Republican introduce the measure, to show everybody that this should have bipartisan support. So kudos to Mann for doing this, and brilliant move by the women's movement. So it passes the House, you can see here by big numbers. It passes the states, Senate by big numbers. Now it has to go to the states. The states line up very quickly. Those Western states quickly approved it. The Northeast quickly approves it, but all of the South votes against it, the entirety of the South. Guess what? By March of 1920, we're 1 state shy, and that 1 state is going to make or break the vote. And that 1 state happens to be Tennessee in the South. So the mothers of the movement are upset. Tennessee's very conservative. It obviously is going to vote this down, and they're going to lose by 1 state. They had over 2/3 of the Congress, almost 3/4 of the states. So the women of the movement all descend on Tennessee. Opponents of women's rights to vote descend on Tennessee. Republicans, preachers, Southerners, they all gather, and Tennessee is ground zero for this battle. Women's suffrage groups pop up in every town. Anti-women's suffrage groups pop up in every town. And it is a bitter, brutal fight. You can see here the opposition, Southern states opposed to it. There were headquarters of men. The National Association opposed to women's suffrage. Come on, guys. So it all comes down to the vote. And when they vote in Tennessee, guess what? It's a tie. It's a tie. 1 state remaining. It's a 48-48 tie. So here's the story of the man, the mother, and the good boy. You know who the man is. Now, it's a tied vote. However, everybody in Tennessee realized that 1 member of the state legislature was homesick that day. And you're looking at him, Harry T. Byrne, who happened to be the youngest member of the legislature at only 23. He looks about 16 here. Looks like Mayor Pete, doesn't he? About 16. So I'm a big fan of Mayor Pete's, by the way. Anyway, so Harry T. Byrne was still living with his mother, okay? And he's homesick. So everybody rushes to find Harry Byrne and have him cast a vote. The opponents to women's suffrage are happy because Harry is a conservative representing a conservative area, so he's going to vote it down. Here's what happens. His mother dresses him up, gets him some soup. Dr. Merriam, my guess would be matzo ball soup. Okay, getting some matzah, getting like a good Jewish mother, and sends him off to cast his vote. Now, before she sends him off, she writes a letter and puts it in his pocket and says, before you vote, you read this letter from your mother. Now, the opponents to women's suffrage, mostly preachers, conservatives, and Southerners, they were demonizing women and they were resorting to bullying and name calling, if you could imagine that in our politics. What they were saying, they were calling my girl Carrie Chapman cat, Carrie Chapman rat. And they said that they smell a rat, which goes back to the old Thomas Paine from the Constitutional Convention. He smells a rat. They smelled a rat from Carrie Chapman cat, rat. So Harry goes to vote. He pulls the letter out of his pocket, and this is what his mother wrote. Don't forget to be a good boy and help Mrs. Cat put the rat in ratification. So Harry listened to his mother, and he voted yes. And it passed by one vote in one state, 80 years after Elizabeth Cady Stanton got turned away in 1840 in Europe. So I'm happy to say Harry Byrne was reelected. They thought he was going to be lynched, and women got the right to vote. Okay, so let's move on quickly. The White House. All right, so I'm going to just do two quick more additional things. I told you that I've interviewed lots and lots of women in elected office and asked them questions. The main question I asked them was, as a woman, what is the biggest challenge you face in politics? So I put together all their answers and I came up with a couple of things. I'm only going to do 4 for the sake of time. The biggest challenge that women told me in elected office, mayors, Congress, state senators, all across the country, number 1 was fundraising. Women have trouble raising money. Now, I don't mean a $25 check that I might send to a candidate or you might send to a candidate, but I mean the big bucks. The big bucks are still of, by, and for men. If you take the typical campaign in this country, and a man's running and a woman's running, 90-some% of the time, the man is going to out fundraise the woman. Well, guess what? If you pick any race around the office and ask me any office or race around the country and say, who's going to win some congressional race in Minnesota? I don't even need to know who's running. I can ask you one question. Who raised the most money? That's who wins. I'll ask you a second question. Who's the incumbent? That's who wins. The incumbent wins 90+% of the time. The person with the most money wins 90+% of the time. Women are not the incumbents and raise less money. So fundraising is a big issue. There have only been 3 women in modern times that have raised money equivalent to men. In fact, these women have outraised men. And that's Hillary Clinton, Sarah Palin, and Nancy Pelosi. Those 3 are unbelievable fundraisers, but the average woman running for office doesn't do it. I had one woman in Alabama. She was a Republican, only woman in the state Senate. And I asked her the question, what's your biggest challenge you face? And she said, I don't play golf. And I said, okay, me neither. What does that mean? And she said, well, where do you think the money's raised? She said, it's raised in 3 places. It's raised in the locker room at the club, and I'm legally not allowed to go in the men's locker room. 2, it's raised in the press box at the Alabama-Auburn football games, and no one invites me. Or 3, on the golf course. So I told her, I said, Senator, with all due respect, learn to play golf. She said, are you kidding me? Who has the time? I can't take 4 or 5 hours out of my day. I'm a part-time state legislator. I'm a mother. I'm a wife. I have a job. Who has time to golf? What did Mark Twain call golf? A good walk interrupted. So she was talking about the challenges of fundraising. Women just can't raise the money. The second thing that women talked about with me was the second shift syndrome. And I put it here on the screen for you. What is the second shift syndrome? cultural anthropologists and sociologists talk about it. Here's what it is. Let's look today at a two-income family. Both wife and husband work. Even in a two-income family, who still does 80+% of the domestic work? The woman. The diaper changing, the child rearing, the laundry, the grocery shopping, the sewing, the ironing, the honey, where did I leave my glasses, finding. So women still do the lion's share of domestic work. Here's what the women were saying to me. They have a job, they have kids, they have obligations, and they have to do the domestic work. Women don't have time. The average man has 2, 3, 4 times as much leisure time than the average woman in the United States, even in the year 2020. So if you want to run for office, you have to go speak before the Miami Beach JCC. You have to go speak before Dr. Miriam's Institute. I have to go speak before the NCJW. You got to fundraise. You got to go to clubs. You got to shake hands. If you're raising children, who has time to do this? Right? So until we can level this out, whereby men are picking up more of the domestic work, and women will not have the time to run for office. Number 3, the empty nest syndrome. The empty nest syndrome. Question, when do men run for office? Answer, whenever the heck they want to. Question, Rachel, when do women run for office? Answer, when the children are raised and out of the home, right? Empty nest. Here's the thing. That's limiting the number of women that are running for office. It's also limiting young women from running for office. And if you limit young women from running for office at the local level, eventually you're going to limit at the state and the national, because the usual trajectory, Trump's an exception to the rule in many ways, but usually you start at the local level and it takes you 2, 3 decades to rise up. So women are waiting. Now, people are waiting longer to get married these days. People are waiting longer to have children these days, which means until the children are out of the house, women will be perceived as being too old to run for office. So we've got to change that. The only other thing I want to talk about in the sake of time is this, and these are fun studies, and I threw the questions out to the women I interviewed, including women that ran for the presidency. So there's some really neat studies that suggest that women are less ambitious than men. Now, before you jump up and yell, ambition's not the right word. I'm not sure what the right word is. Maybe women are more pragmatic, have more morals, more realistic, scruples. I'm not sure what the word is, but here's what we find. Studies say this, men, if you had a 5% chance of winning this race, would you run? Answer, of course. Women, if you had a 5% chance of winning, would you run? The answer, of course not. Next, men, if you had to raise money from corrupt sources, the Koch brother on the right, Soros on the left, whatever, you had to raise big money from corporations, a lobbyist, would you still run? Answer, men, of course. Women, no. They don't want to raise that blood money. Next question. What if you knew you were going to be the subject of negative attack ads? Would you still run? Men, of course. Women, absolutely not. Get the point? So I don't think ambition's the right word. I think scruples, realism, I'm not sure what the right word is. But the point of the matter is this. If you want to win election, you need to be a single-minded seeker of elections. You need to be the shark on the blood trail. You need to just go all in for election. If women have hesitancies about negative ads, fundraising, my chances of winning, we're limiting the pool of the number of women who are running. If women aren't running at equal levels, they're not going to get elected at equal levels. So for all these reasons, these are some of the challenges facing women, and I'm cutting that way short. Okay, here we go. So last thing I'm going to do, women have been running for office for a long time, for the presidency. The very first woman, here's your trivia contest. So the very first woman that ran for office was Victoria Woodhull in 1872. How about that? I'm a big Victoria Woodhull fan. She was young, attractive, smart, ambitious, feisty. She was a self-taught lawyer. Women couldn't go to law school, published author. So Victoria Woodhull in 1872. However, neither party would let her run, so she had to run on a third party, an equal rights platform. Guess who her vice presidential running mate was? As a favor to my buddy Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Frederick Douglass was her vice presidential running mate. So in 2008, I used to write a Sunday column for the Sun Sentinel, our newspaper. If any of you stayed awake through that column, I did it for years. And I remember in 2008, when Hillary and Obama were both running, a woman and an African-American man, I remember writing my column saying that Victoria Woodhull and Frederick Douglass were in heaven looking down saying, "What on earth took you so long?" So now that we have Biden and Kamala, I may break that line out again. So Victoria Woodhull, of course, she couldn't legally vote, right? Not until 1920. When she went to try to vote, she was arrested. So she couldn't even campaign for herself. She was in prison. The next woman that ran was Belva Lockwood. She ran twice in the 1880s. Belva was tough. She just wanted to shake things up and push the envelope and make a point. And she did. Then it would be quite some time before we had another woman, but we had an historic first. This is Margaret Chase Smith, 1964. Now, no one out there is old enough to remember 1964, so I'm going to take it back. Margaret Chase Smith became the first woman to run for president on a major party ticket, Republican. Margaret Chase Smith was elected to both the House and the Senate. She said that her big regret was this. I didn't get a chance to interview her. I'll talk about those later. But she said her big regret was this, that the press would always call her Mrs. Smith instead of representative or senator, whereas men were always called what? Senator, governor, whatever. The next woman to run, here we have another historic first, 1972, Shirley Chisholm becomes the first African-American woman to run for president. Always had a great slogan about unbought and unbossed. So Shirley Chisholm broke the color barrier, first African-American woman to run in 1972. And by the way, Kamala Harris's campaign literature is channeling Shirley Chisholm. She used the same color, font, look, and image of Shirley Chisholm. A nice historic touch there, Kamala. At any rate, I did have a chance to interview Shirley Chisholm. She was from New York, as you all remember. And you all know that there's a law in New York that says that you have to move to Florida at a certain age. You're all aware of that, of course. So because Shirley Chisholm was from New York, she moved to Florida, Palm City. So I asked her about her big regrets. This is what she told me. She said her big regret was this: Black men refused to support her, saying that the first African-American to run has to be a man, not a woman. She said the same men that I marched with in the 60s for civil rights refused to support me because I was a woman. Therefore, this is what she said. She said, you watch, we'll elect a black man president before a white woman. And I went, no way. She was right, wasn't she? So remarkable. Next one, 1984. Geraldine Ferraro from New York, first woman vice presidential nominee on a major party ticket. As I said at the outset, we've had women president and vice president on third party tickets in history, including women of color, but on a major party ticket, Democrat. She was Walter Mondale's pick for vice president in 1984. Ferraro was a three-term congresswoman from New York, and before that, a tough lawyer and prosecutor. Because she was from New York, that meant what? She moved to Florida later in life. So I had a chance to interview her. She spent some time in Key Largo, interviewed her twice. And this is what she told me. She said her biggest frustration was this. She said, as a woman, she knew that she was going to be asked certain types of questions that a man would not, and there's a double standard. If you look at policy issues, we have women's issues like child rearing, healthcare, the environment, versus men's issues are the force issues, economics, anti-crime, national security. So she said, I didn't want to be perceived as only caring about women's issues. So she said, for my first major speech that I gave as the first woman vice presidential nominee and a major party ticket. She said, I picked national security. And I said, how did it go? She said, the speech went well, but the thing was a mess. I said, why? She said, after a half an hour speech on national security, guess what the first question was that I was asked? What designer are you going to be wearing? Calvin Klein, Halston, I don't know my designers, which is obvious. Who are you going to? And I said to her, what'd you say? She said, nothing. She said, because if I answered the question and talked about fashion, would I look like a tough commander in chief that could stand up to the Soviets back when presidents used to stand up to Russia? She said, on the other hand, if I told them the heck with you, I'm not answering that question. She said, I'd be the word that rhymes with rich. And in fact, Barbara Bush used to call her the woman that rhymes with witch. So she said it was a no-win situation. The other thing we talked about, she said she was frustrated with, if a man runs for office, they tend to leave the woman alone. They went after Hillary bad, and they went after Michelle Obama bad. But generally, they leave them alone. She said, but on the other hand, we find if a woman runs for office, they go after her kids, they go after her husband. And Ferrara's husband, John Zuccaro, they went after him horrifically. So she was very disappointed in that. Then in 1988, Pat Schroeder ran for president, a woman from District 1 in Colorado. Pat Schroeder ran after Gary Hart dropped out of the race. If anybody's had the chance, I've had the great honor of getting to know Pat Schroeder well. She wrote the foreword for one of my books on women in politics. It probably doubled the sale of my book. And she and I have done a number of conferences together. I had her at Lynn University again this winter. Anyways, I asked Schroeder about challenges, and this is what she said. It's something that I can't really talk about as a man, but what she said is this. She said, sometimes a woman's biggest critic is another woman. She said, I was shocked at how many women went after me. She gave me a couple of examples. I'll just share two with you. She said, an older woman came up to me after a speech one day and handed me a check. And it was a couple bucks, 10, 15 bucks. She said, but the woman wanted to whisper something to me. So Schroeder said, I bent down and the woman said, now get a haircut, do something with your hair. Wow. Men are never told to do something with their hair. Donald Trump has the weirdest hair of any carbon-based life form on Earth. I have messy hair. Nobody cares about a man's hair, but a woman's hair that can do that. He also said that another time a woman came up to her and handed her a check and said, do you know that your purse and your shoes don't match? And I admit, this was one of the first times I interviewed Schroeder 20-some years ago. I had to say to her, what does that mean? Now I understand that shoes and purses and all that have to, could you imagine? I mean, nobody cares that I have 3 jackets that are the same color, 3 shirts that are the same color, and 3 pairs of pants are the same color. It's my uniform. I just rotate. Nobody cares, but for a woman, they do. I did a Sunday talk show for our NBC channel up in Palm Beach. It starts from Boca North. I did a Sunday talk show for years and years and years and got to be friends with one of the senior women anchors who was a wonderful person. And she would always tell me, she said, you're not going to believe how much mail I get that I wore that dress a month ago. Every Sunday I look the same. She said, you're not going to believe how much mail that maybe I gained weight or my hair's a mess. I'm always gaining weight. My hair is always a mess. It didn't matter for me when I was on the show, but it mattered for her. So these are the kind of, Schroeder also told me that in her first debate, she said it became such an issue that she had a daughter when she ran for president. And they were saying that a woman shouldn't run if she has a child because you're neglecting your maternal responsibilities. Schroeder said, I'm glad you asked me that question because my male opponent has 2 children. Isn't he neglecting his paternal responsibilities? And Schroeder's answer, and they would say, as a woman, how can you run? She would say, look, I have a uterus and a brain, and they both work just fine. In 1999, for the 2000 race, Elizabeth Dole ran, Bob Dole's wife, so direct ties to the office. She had been a former 2-time cabinet secretary under Reagan and Bush, Labor, and transportation. At any rate, she said that when she was campaigning in New Hampshire, of course, the snow and the sludge, reporters asked her, how are you going to campaign because you have high heel pumps on? First off, she wasn't wearing Saturday night, go to the club high heel pumps, but that became an issue. And I asked her, what'd you say? She said, I couldn't say anything because like others, if she talked about her shoes, she wouldn't look tough. And if she told them to go, you know what, she would look angry. Carol Moseley Braun, first Black woman in the Senate, Kamala Harris the second. Braun from Illinois. I was never a fan of Braun's. I thought she was ethically challenged. She ran briefly for president in 2004. Hillary, of course, almost won the presidency, almost became the nominee in 2008 and actually won the majority of the popular vote in 2016 by the largest margin of victory in American history, actually. Sarah Palin. Oh, I don't know how this picture got in there. You know, my son must have been Dr. Miriam, Karen, I apologize. Rachel, I assure you, my son has a sense of humor. He must have been in my, anyways, first Republican vice presidential nominee in 2008. This time around, we had 6 women run for president, which is a record. That's remarkable. And Harris is still in the hunt as VP. Let me just end this by saying, women have been elected all around the world, friends, yet not in the United States. Here's a list of some of the countries where women have served at the head. Here's a map. This is last year. I'm sorry, I didn't update it. The color, these are the countries that have a woman serving as prime minister or president. Here's a list of all the places in history that have elected a woman prime minister or president. Let me end with this thought. So why hasn't the United States elected a woman yet? 2 quick arguments. There's 100, but just 2. I'll save you the read of my book, Electing Madam President. I'll save you the 400 pages. So number 1, around the world, most women have had direct family ties to the office. A father before them, their husband before them, a brother have been elected. So that direct family tie helps women. Don't direct family ties help the men in the United States? John Quincy Adams, our 6th president, was the son of John, our 2nd. Benjamin Harrison was the grandson of William Henry Harrison. W was the son of George H.W. Bush. The Senate is sometimes called the Millionaires Club or the Harvard-Yale Alumni Association. I also call the Senate the Sons of Former Senators Club. So what's good for the goose should be good for the gander. And these direct family ties should soon start to help women. We've also already seen that Bob Dole's wife and Bill Clinton's wife, 2 a presidential nominee and a president, their wives ran. So secondly, most women around the world that have run governments have been prime ministers, not presidents. There's a difference. It's a lot easier to win high office in a prime ministerial system. Think of Thatcher in England. Think of Golda Meir in Israel. Think of Gandhi, and think of Kim Campbell in Canada. So under these kind of systems, here's what you have in a prime ministerial system. If your party wins a majority and you're the leader of the party, you're the prime minister. Your party doesn't even need to win a majority, just a plurality, 40%. And if you can form a coalitional government, like in Israel, you become the prime minister, right? It's a lot easier to have a safe seat in Congress. Pelosi would be our prime minister if we had a parliamentary system. It's a lot easier to have a safe seat and become the PM than win a presidency. In the United States, we have a 2-year-long, multiple hundreds of billions of dollars, $1 billion plus billions and billions until you add in all the other money raised, campaign. That's harder for women to do. So everybody, it's not if, it's when we elect Madam President. We're getting closer. We're knocking on that glass ceiling. And I think this generation is going to change things because you and I maybe didn't grow up with a female boss, a female doctor, a female lawyer, a female accountant, a female vet, a female professor. This generation, every one of my students on campus has had a female boss, doctor, lawyer, and they don't even think about it. If I were to even ask them, they would go, "What are you saying, Dr. Watson?" It's just a given. They've grown up with that. When I was in college and I took my politics and history classes, here's the bad news. There were no women in class. Today, every university I go to, over half the poli-sci and history majors are women. Women are breaking the glass, shattering the glass ceiling in the sciences. Women make up the majority now going to veterinary medical schools, law schools. They're getting close to the majority in medical schools. It's changing, so it's not if, but when. And thank you for your time.
Oh, Robert, thank you so much. You've done it again. You've hit it out of the ballpark. I want to apologize. Right before our presentation, I was telling you about this embarrassing situation where someone else didn't realize they were unmuted. And same thing happened just now. I was unmuted and I said to Karen, let's just do 3, meaning that we'd rather have you talk more and do a minimal question. So I apologize to 143 out of you.
No worries.
I had 143 responses to my text saying, Miriam, you're unmuted. So that was excellent, superb, informative. And you know,
My, oh my.
Oh my God, it really was. And you know, you really did a big favor for the 3 institutions, National Council, my Holocaust Institute, and the JCC, because people don't realize that part of our mission is to fight injustice everywhere, anywhere. Like in the Institute, it's not just about the Holocaust, it's about human beings, women, injustice anywhere, and to bring community together into these intellectual discussions. So on behalf of everyone, I just thank you. That was enormously intellectually humorous, wonderful, informative. And I'd like to turn it over to Karen. And hey, if you want to have more than 3 questions and people want to stay on, that's fine with me.
Let me
Karen?
quick add one thing.
Yeah.
I'm glad you brought that up, Dr. Miriam. So we all know and love Martin Luther King's great line about a threat to justice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. An injustice anywhere is an injustice everywhere. That you can't be Black and not support women's rights. You can't be Jewish and not support the Black Lives Matter. You can't be a gay and not support women's issues. And Martin Luther King was the embodiment of that. In '64 with the Civil Rights Act and in '65 with the Voting Rights Act, he needed Lyndon Johnson's support in a big way. And yet King came out and opposed Johnson's behavior on the Vietnam War.
Thank you. You know, you reminded me that when I was sitting on the Miami Beach Community Relations Council, the subject of giving human rights to gays came up. And somebody said to me, well, you're an Orthodox Jew, which I am not, and a Holocaust survivor and so forth. How do you feel about that? And I said, hey, I can't keep fighting for what happened to the Jews in the Holocaust, the injustice, and not continue to fight for injustice for everyone else. And I'd like to say that very few people know, I was chair at the time that I led the mandate to give gays on Miami Beach their equal rights. So
I am not at all surprised to hear that. But what I want to make as a point is, I think way before a century before Martin Luther King, the folks who were the embodiment of fighting for everyone were the suffragettes. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott fought against an injustice against Blacks. They fought for women. They fought for everyone. So they were the embodiment of that. So.
Thank
Karen?
you. And by the way, I didn't mean to say that Orthodox Jews are against giving equal rights. It's just that that was the perception of the person that said that to me. So Karen, I turn it back to you.
Well, I couldn't agree more. And, you know, thank you for ending on such a positive and hopeful note there. So with that, somebody is asking, what female politician today would you like to interview most? And I have a suspicion I know the answer to that, but could you let us know?
Female politician today I'd like to most interview would be Kamala Harris, because she's, you know, the VP. And, you know, it's exciting. And as Barack Obama found out, and as Harris knows, her every action and her every inaction will be speaking for an entire racial group and an entire sexual group. So she's speaking for all women. She's speaking for all African Americans. All, you know, Kamala Harris is interesting beyond that. Her mother was from India. Her father was from Jamaica. She was raised in Canada, and her father had left the mother. So she brings in also, you know, child of immigrants. So she's a historic first in so many ways. She's an embodiment of where this country is headed, and that's fascinating. But consequently, she will have that added burden that everything she does and doesn't do, she'll be judged accordingly. If a white male politician makes a mistake, he made a mistake. If a female politician makes a mistake, you see, women can't. I had the great honor years ago, I convened a national conference, probably 18 years ago or more, on civil rights. Yeah, it was on civil rights. And one of my guests was the daughter from Brown, the Brown versus Board of Education, Linda Brown, 1954 Supreme Court case that ended Plessy versus Ferguson and legalized segregation. And I asked the daughter from this famous case, I said, "You've got to give me a story." And she said, "Here it is. My mother told me and my siblings that we must always be perfect. Perfect. Because if I get a B or a D in class, people say, you see, we desegregated, and look, the little black girl can't." She said, if I get divorced, they're going to say, you see, the black community doesn't. She said, if I commit a crime, you see. If I get angry and swear, you see. She said, we had to be perfect. And I said, what's that burden like? She said, I've told my own kids they must be perfect too. So Kamala Harris has little room margin for error, and we're already seeing this on certain news outlets and from certain politicians. That where men can make that mistake and it's no big deal, but Kamala Harris will make it, and it'll be amplified through the lens of all these historic firsts. So yeah, I'd want to interview Harris, although I got to say, if I could take a time machine and talk to Victoria Woodhull and Carrie Chapman Catt and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, those are three of my faves. I'd also go back while I'm on that time machine and hang out with Eleanor Roosevelt a little bit and go talk with the first feminist, Abigail Adams. So I got a lot of people I'd like to talk to. That'll have to wait for heaven.
We have a question about the role of Black suffragettes and what happened to them after the 19th Amendment.
Yeah, good. So we had, everybody knows about Jim Crow, of course, starting after the Civil War and the Klan, you know, poll taxes, literacy tests, voting clauses, even I mean, that's all ridiculous, but whites only primaries and all sorts of other tricks. So black men were given the right to vote in 1870, but there were all sorts of gimmicks to deny blacks from getting the right to vote, quite frankly, until the 24th Amendment in 1964, which legally ended all those Jim Crow laws. However, there were also social pressures to keep blacks from voting. The same happened to black women after the 19th Amendment. So for example, what we saw happening throughout Dixie was what was called the WCC. It's the White Citizens Council. They took their Klan robes off and put a three-piece suit on. So if you're black and you're trying to vote, even though you now have the right to vote, here's what will happen. You'll be fired from your job. Your child will come home from school and say, "Daddy, I was kicked out of school because they said I had beer in my locker. I didn't." Well, here's the thing. The White Citizens Council would be the principal, the mayor, the police chief, the banker. And what they would do is they would just throw the kid out of the school to teach you a lesson. You better not vote. Even if you were white. Let's take Bill. My friend Bill is here. Bill's a tough guy. Bill would stand up and do the right thing. I have no question about it. So as a white man, Bill would have tried to help blacks to vote. But guess what? Bill would go to his bank and the banker would say, "Who are you? You don't have an account with us." You get the point? Because the banker's with the WCC. So Bill would then go talk to the police chief. Do you know what happened? Well, the police chief's in the WCC. Then he takes it to court. The judge is in the WCC. So what happened is these social, subtle and not so subtle social pressures kept black men from voting even after they had the constitutional right. The same for black women. There were social pressures. You know, I'll give you one quick example. I wrote a book about the 2000 election debacle here in Florida, but I tried to approach it differently. There were a lot of books about it that, you know, Bush versus Gore. And what I did was I actually talked to people who claimed to have been turned away from voting. I talked to the Broward County, his name was Jess Gittleson. I talked to the guy that repaired the voting machines, you know, because the voting machines went on the blank. So for example, I talked to a lot of Black women who said that they were turned away from voting. So I wanted to interview as many as I could, and all their stories matched. So I think that it was legit. Here's what a lot of them told me. They would show up to vote, and there would be this big, tough white guy with like a military haircut who walked up to them and said, why are you here? They say, we're here to vote. I need your license and your license plate number. And a lot of them told me, we went home. And I say, why? They can't do that. They said, you didn't live through the 60s. They would take your license plate. And this guy looks paramilitary. I mean, now, if I heard someone say that, I would say, nah, but multiple people said that. In other words, a lot of the Black suffragettes, they don't make the textbooks. And a lot of them didn't vote because of the double whammy of being Black and a woman and having all that social pressure placed upon them. Karen, I'll be happy to take another question too.
Yes, we have one more here asking about the reaction to or the focus on Harris's criticism of Biden earlier. And do you think that that is going to be a distraction, you know, that we're going to see more of that? And is that, you know, more typical than what you would see in male competitors?
Do I think Trump and the Republicans are going to use it? It's going to be a massive distraction. Of course, they're going to run that 30-second commercial all day and night. Do I think it's a big deal? Not at all. Is it historically unprecedented? Absolutely not. Here's the kicker. Most presidents and vice presidents have not gotten along. The only person that Lyndon Johnson disliked more than Kennedy was his brother, Bobby Kennedy. The only person that didn't like Lyndon Johnson more than JFK was RFK. It went both ways. Bob Dole picked Jack Kemp as his vice presidential running mate in '96. And for insiders, I did a media show about this. This was almost farcical. Within the Republican Party, Dole and Kemp never missed an opportunity to slam one another, but they got together. George H.W. Bush, when your friends say, oh, Biden said, Kamala Harris said Biden didn't do a good job on busing. George H.W. Bush, when he was running against Reagan in 1980 in the Republican primary, said Reagan's policies are voodoo economics and will blow up the budget deficit. And Reagan picked H.W. He was right to pick H.W. Reagan lacked any understanding whatsoever of international affairs and national security, even if you like him. This is not a partisan shot, it's a fact. H.W. Bush had a fantastic command of foreign policy. Presidents and vice presidents didn't get along. They didn't like one another throughout history. Clinton and Gore were an anomaly. Obama and Biden, an anomaly. So yeah, this is no big deal. Here's what else I think it is. Here's my view of it. Joe Biden's biggest strength is he's Scranton Joe. He's a regular guy. He's a nice guy. Do you know the Washingtonian magazine? Congress for years, and the magazine, every year they used to have these great polls. Who's the dumbest member of Congress? Who's the smartest member of Congress? Who's the nicest member of Congress? Who's the meanest member? Michelle Bachmann would always win the dumbest. And by the way, it was bipartisan. Republicans and Democrats, staffers voted on it. Anyways, Biden would always win who's the nicest guy in Congress. What this shows is Joe Biden does not harbor a grudge, unlike another president. What this shows is Joe Biden can reach across the aisle, unlike another president. What this shows is Joe Biden will shake hands and talk to anybody, which is what we need. He's willing to forgive and work with Kamala Harris, who hammered him. And in fact, the context of Harris hammering Biden on a vote on busing. And of course, Joe Biden had a 4-decade career of supporting civil rights and women. He introduced some of the measures on violence against women and equal pay. Biden was one of the co-sponsors. At any rate, here's the kicker. The context of Harris hitting Biden was because Biden said nice things about Jesse Helms, Strom Thurmond, Bob Byrd, some of these old-time Southern racist senators. Now, you know, those guys were bad guys. They were on the wrong side of history. But Biden's comment was made within the context that he would work with everyone. And I think that's what we need now. course I don't like Jesse Helms. Of course I didn't like Strom Thurmond, but by God, you got to work with them. I remember, I'll give you one last story. I served on George McGovern's board for years until his passing a couple years ago. Don't be impressed. I think I was the only historian that agreed to go to Mitchell, South Dakota a couple times a year for work. Everybody else is like, nah, I think we'll pass on that one. It's not like it's the Kennedy board. You get to go to Boston and work. At any rate, so I convened the ribbon cutting for McGovern for his George and Eleanor McGovern Library and Center for Public Service and Leadership. And I convened a couple of events. I asked McGovern for one event, who do you want to be the keynoter? He said, my best friend, Bob Dole. I went, okay. And I said, well, listen, why don't we have you and Dole sit on stage and just talk? So he said, okay. So Dole and McGovern say, okay, Robert, we want you to interview us. What should we say? And I said, you're George McGovern and Bob Dole. I'm not telling you, you just talk. I'll just sit there and get out of the way. Anyways, the two of them were in tears as they talked about their friendship and getting along. And this is what McGovern and Dole both said. We would fight on the floor of the Senate. And then we'd go out for drinks that night and hug, shake, and pass legislation. And what Dole and McGovern said was, you know, once a week, we got together for dinner. Get this, Ted Kennedy, Jesse Helms, Strom Thurmond, Daniel Patrick Moynihan. Politics makes for strange bedfellows. They were all good friends. They said we all worked together. Joe Biden was one of those people. So Harris's criticism, I see it as a lemon, and we can make lemonade out of it. I see it as a positive character endorsement that Biden will sit down and work with most anybody and forgive and forget. Abraham Lincoln was the definition of magnanimity. I think we need a little bit of that. I'm not saying Biden's Lincoln, but I'm saying we need some of that magnanimity and empathy, collegiality. We need to dial it back a little bit. So I see the selection of Harris as that being a visual manifestation of this wonderful character trait of and I met Joe Biden, talked to him for a while one time, and he was Scranton Joe, man. He put his hands on my shoulders and gave me a massage while he talked to me. And he finished our conversation with a little punch to my belly. I told him I was from Pennsylvania. He's like, oh yeah. I'm like, all right, that's a good thing, right? That's a good thing.
Well, this was such a delight and so, I mean, I've learned so much. I think we all can sit here for another few hours listening to you speak on a variety of topics. It's been such a wonderful pleasure. Thank you for all being here on a Wednesday afternoon. One last question for you, Robert, is, you know, will you be speaking again? Somebody asked about your lecture series you do on the cruise line. I don't know, you know, when that's going to be able to start up again, but what is your sort of next big thing? Share with us where we can tune in to hear you again.
No, I'm retiring. I'm retiring this afternoon. I'm giving it up.
No way.
I write every day of my life. I speak every day of my life. I go to board meetings every day. Yeah, so Rachel and Dr. Miriam and Karen, I'd be honored to come back. I've met a lot. I admire what the three of you do. I know your organizations well. Like I said at the outset, I have a long history. Be happy to come back. The cruises are all on hold. When we're behind COVID, we'll get back to all that. And all the new book releases, I have 3 books that are going to be released in February. I can't believe, it must be a record because they've all been on hold. They've all been put on ice through this COVID crisis. So yeah, we're still Zooming, if that's a noun that turned into a verb, gerund or gerund or whatever. So we're still Zooming, and I look forward to seeing everybody on Zoom, and really look forward Karen to coming out for Karen and Richard to coming out for some vegetarian food, and Bill and Iris, I look forward to coming. You know, Karen and Richard and Bill and Iris always cook for me. So if you want to be a really good friend, I think you know the. So everybody, thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you, and please come back next week for our last August event with Reva Ginsburg, who will be talking about the Yiddish language and culture, and we're going to be doing switching gears a little bit and celebrating everything Yiddish. So you're all invited to come back next Wednesday at 12:30.
And we are going to announce, but not today, it's a surprise, next Wednesday when Dr. Watson will be on again for a program that the JCC and University of Miami are planning Labor Day weekend, but it's a secret until next week. So be sure and tune in, and we'll give you all the details then. Thank you. And Rachel, it was our pleasure to partner with you, NCJW, on this project.
Absolutely. Stay safe, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you for being with us today. Until next week. Bye-bye.